Hi, I'm Jordan Hillhouse, and this is Intermittent Thoughts. Friday the 13th has a reputation of being one of the most basic, by-the-numbers horror franchises in cinematic history. Teens show up to a summer camp, they engage in some risque behavior, and end up having their lives cut short by the unstoppable Jason Voorhees. Needless to say, critics hate these movies. Even fans view the franchise with rose-colored glasses, dismissing many of the tropes, inconsistencies, and plot holes as part of the charm of the films. So are these movies ridiculous? Yes. But are they completely without story? I don't agree with that at all. In fact, it might surprise some people, but this film series has a pretty complicated timeline. Though the first film came out in 1980, the actual story starts years prior. I'm not saying that this was thought out before, like, a brilliant Pixar universe theory, but there is more to this Dead Teenager series besides dead teenagers. Though there are a lot of those too. So let's look at the timeline of Friday the 13th. Spoiler alert, if you haven't seen any of these 20-plus-year-old movies, get on that. Alright, our timeline starts all the way back in 1930 when Pamela Sue is born. 5 years later, Camp Crystal Lake opens in Sussex County, New Jersey. Sometime around 1944 to 1945, Pamela Sue marries Elias Voorhees, and right after they get married, she gives birth to a son named Jason, born on June 13, 1946. Pamela gets a job at Camp Crystal Lake as a cook, but in 1957, tragedy strikes as Jason drowns. She blames the counselor for the death of her son by not paying attention as he's swimming. 1 year later, 2 counselors at the camp are murdered and the killer is never found. After some more bad luck, including bad water and a few property fires, Camp Crystal Lake is closed in 1962. 16 years later, in 1978, Steve Christie, the son of the original owners, decides to reopen Camp Crystal Lake, an idea that's not too popular among the locals. 1 year later, on Friday, June the 13th, 1979, the events of the first film take place. In that film, several counselors and Steve Christie are murdered by Pamela. She thinks that doing this will shut the camp down for good, and a tragedy like the one that happened to her will never happen to any other parent again. Except for the parents of all those people she killed that night. Anyway, the surviving counselor, Alice, kills Mrs. Voorhees and spends a few weeks in counseling after the events. About 2 months later, Alice is killed in her apartment by who many people feel to be Jason. But I personally have my own theory where it's Elias getting revenge. For the record, I have no proof for this theory. Moving on. This is where the timeline starts to get intertwined. In 1982, Chris Higgins from Part 3 is attacked by Jason. She gets away, but Jason, who's living in the woods during all this time, strikes back 2 years later. Friday the 13th Parts 2, 3, and 4 all take place over the same week in July 1984. The events of Part 2 happen on Wednesday, July 11th, Part 3 takes place that Friday, and Part 4 takes place on that Sunday. In the climactic scene of Part 4, 12-year-old Tommy Jarvis kills Jason, and the nightmare is finally over and Jason is dead. But Tommy isn't doing so well, and he spends the next few years in mental facilities. This is where the events of Part 5 happen. Spoiler alert, Roy the paramedic goes on a revenge-driven rampage dressed as Jason. He does this because his son was murdered. Roy kills a lot of people, but not the actual person that killed his son. And in the end, Roy is killed and Tommy is thought to be the one to continue the Jason legacy. But the movie didn't make a lot of money at the box office, and Jason was brought back from the dead 1 year later by Tommy because plot, I guess. Sometime between 1984 and 1990, Crystal Lake was renamed Forest Green, but Jason didn't get that memo, and once again, many people are killed. Tommy chains Jason to a rock and traps him at the bottom of Crystal Lake. A few months later, on October 13th, a 7-year-old Tina Shepard accidentally kills her father with her telekinetic powers. And this series is starting to get crazy. 10 years later, the events of Part 7 take place, and 2 years later, Jason takes Manhattan for 10 minutes. Now, these are the 8 Paramount films, and this is where I think the timeline ends. However, this wouldn't be a complete timeline if I didn't include the New Line films. But if you think Parts 6, 7, and 8 were far-fetched, just wait. The very next year after Jason took Manhattan, he goes back home. and a special unit task force sets up a trap in his own backyard and blows him up. However, his spirit still possesses people, but he has to get some of those people naked and shave them first. Jason also has a sister from Elias and another woman. The sister is important in bringing Jason back to life before his niece sends him to hell by stabbing him with a magic dagger. Sometime between 2003 and 2010, Freddy vs. Jason takes place. The 2009 remake has its own timeline, so I'm not going to include it at all. In 2010, Jason Voorhees is frozen at the Camp Crystal Lake Research Facility. He remains in that state until he's unfrozen on the spaceship the Grendel. See why I don't really take the New Line films that serious? So that's the timeline in all of its ridiculous glory. Yeah, these movies are silly, but I hope that you see that there's more to these movies than just a high body count. I hope you liked this video, and if you did, be sure to subscribe for more content. And if you didn't like this video, go on and subscribe too. Hopefully you'll end up liking one of my videos. I'll say if you don't like me by maybe the third video, you can unsubscribe. Fair enough? Alright, thanks again for watching. Talk to you guys later. Bye!